Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rolanda Larkins, and I will be your host tonight for the Fireside Reading Series. The Fireside Reading Series is the firm's longest-running program, celebrating 31 seasons in partnership with the St. Paul Public Library. Thanks for joining us in our second season at Rondo Community. Fireside is made possible in part through an appropriation from the Minnesota State Legislature to the Friends of St. Paul Public Library as the Minnesota Center for the Book. Books for sale this evening are kindly provided by Black Garment, located on University Avenue. We're so grateful for your support and your presence here this evening. We will begin with the reading and then open up to questions from you. When we do this, please wait for someone with the camera link mic to get to you. It makes it a bit easier for online communication for our online audience and the speaker. Friends online, we have someone in the room to relay your questions as well. I'm happy to introduce you tonight to JoJo Bell. Jokeda Bell is an executive director of exhibitions and programming for the African American Interpretive Center of Minnesota. Her roles within the organization have led to collaborative programming with the Minnesota Historical Society and the Minnesota Museum of American Art. She curated the Builders exhibition for AAICM, which was named one of the top 10 art exhibitions of the year by the Star Tribune. She is a PhD student in the history department at the University of Minnesota. She studies Black women and land ownership in the upper Midwest. So please welcome Jokeda Bell.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you to the friends for having me, and thank you for all coming out tonight. So we'll start with a brief reading. So this is in the introduction if you guys want to follow along. On August 30th, 1944, a young woman from North Minneapolis waited in the wings of the Mansfield Theater on Broadway in New York for her cue. The unknown actress had risen through the ranks of the American Negro Theater, a Black theater company that would produce legends like Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier. On that August night, the play Anna LaCosta had just made the leap from the small American Negro theater stage in Harlem to the bright lights of Broadway. Hilda Simms was making history as she moved under the stage lights and transformed into a tough yet vulnerable sex worker looking for stability through familial ties. Equally significant, Simms and her castmates were debuting a play that did not center on race issues but featured an all-Black cast. The presentation and success of Anna LaCosta at the American Negro Theater created many opportunities for the small all-Black cast, especially for its star Hilda Simms. In addition to more complex characters, the play featured the type of dynamic scenes that were usually denied Black actors, who were expected to provide comedic relief in early film and theater. For Hilda, the opportunity to be a dramatic actress on Broadway was a dream come true. Yet the realization of those dreams meant more than mere fame to the rising star. For Hilda and for the cast and crew, moving to the Broadway stage offered a chance to effect social change through their productions and led to the question, how will Black Americans use their platforms to address the entrenched social segregation and violence of the post-World War II period? This question shaped Hilda's professional career beyond Anna LaCosta and ultimately landed her in the crosshairs of the FBI.
Thank you for that. So our first question of the night is, can you talk a bit about the way you approach the balance of historical context and a biographical story in Red Stain, because you balance it so well?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I kind of knew at the outset I wanted to be kind of more than like a linear telling of her story. You know, in terms of structure, it was easy, right? Because I could start with her birth and, you know, everything that happened in between and like, you know, her death. But I think adding the context for the period, you know, like growing up in North Side, Great Depression era Minneapolis, moving to Virginia from there and experiencing racism in a more like blatant form, right? And then eventually moved to New York and becoming a part of the American Negro Theater. So all that I felt like really needed contextualization to really understand her story and to understand why her story was so remarkable. And you know, I was a public historian then, and then I joined the PhD program to become an academic. So of course, you know, the history piece was going to be pretty important for me that way too.
So when did you first encounter her
Mhm.
story?
Mhm.
And like kind of, how did you work your way around the book when you first encountered it?
Yeah, this I'm like, what year was that? So I and as you mentioned earlier, the executive director of the African American Interpretive Center in Minnesota, so AICM. And we create we create exhibitions and events based on Black Minnesota history. And so I'm always looking for, kind of like, I hate to say novel, but I guess in a sense, right? Novel stories people hadn't heard of, or events that were important that maybe need, like discovering or more
Right,
discussion. Exactly. And so I came across Hilda, like, there are scattered articles about her in the Star Tribune, older articles. She had a Wikipedia page. And I wanted to do a presentation on her for my organization. And I was just looking for things, and I was like, oh, surely there's a book about her, right? Because she's so remarkable. And if you guys have read the book, you understand why. But I was like, surely there has to be a book. So I just, something I could use to guide the presentation on her. And I was really surprised that there was nothing.
Nothing.
And I just was like, this is not possible. And I think it's just symbolizes like how we kind of don't tell the stories of Black women, but also like Minnesotans, right? In general, Minnesota history is kind of just like, has so much more to be explored there, but especially when you think about Black Minnesota too.
Right.
So that must have been, I want to say, I feel like this is wrong, but maybe around like 2017, 18. So like it was before the pandemic, because I was planning the presentation to happen at the Coven in Minneapolis when it's moved now, but it has a couple other locations now. But yeah.
So I'm curious, because you did bring up, and I think it's a really important topic to bring up, the history of, just the Black experience being not documented. How did you work your way around that research? And what was your process?
Yeah, what's really interesting for Hilda and for this book is that, and I found this out later, apparently there are some primary sources related to Hilda that are at the Gibbons collection at the U. But her sister, when Hilda died, her sister actually donated all of her papers to the Schoenberg Center for Black Research in Harlem. So yeah, so I actually had to go to Harlem to do the research for most of the book. So I think it's just finding where those things are, that's kind of initial hurdle to get over, again, especially if you don't have something like a book or something longer form that has citations where you could follow it, right, and figure out where all this information came from. So I think that was the workaround of it being basically kind of starting from scratch in terms of finding those primary sources for the book.
I want to open it up to the audience for a second. Does anyone have a question thus far? Could you go ahead and give us another reading of the book, please?
Yeah, sure. And see if I want to prep this. So I think this kind of falls in line with your earlier question, or just what you just asked about, Black Minnesota history in particular being hard to find. And so when I did the first chapter called Minneapolis Roots, I thought it was very important to highlight some of these Black history events and people that are important to the story that, I don't want to say they're necessarily hidden because people have written about them before, but I just wanted to make sure they were very much, because they're part of Hilda's story. So that involves the Phyllis Wheatley House. I call it house. That's what it was called in 1920s, but community center now. But okay, so supporting a large family in the midst of the Depression was no small feat. While Emil, so Hilda's dad, worked odd jobs in the neighborhood throughout Hilda's childhood, like others living through the period, most able-bodied members of the Moses family had to pitch in where they could. Hilda was no different. As a young girl, she worked odd jobs that included babysitting and lighting fires on Saturday morning for her Jewish neighbors. In the summer of 1937, after graduating from St. Margaret's, Hilda began work at Minneapolis's Phyllis Wheatley House, a historically Black settlement home. Wheatley provided Hilda with the opportunity to explore activism and acting within the confines of the small but influential Black community of Minneapolis. The settlement house movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries didn't miss Minneapolis. The Phyllis Wheatley House opened in 1924 with a primary goal of providing social services to the growing number of Black women coming into the city during Great Migration. And actually, it's not just Black women, but that's just kind of was also my focus in the book. As the Depression ravaged the country, Black Minnesotans found themselves hit harder than their white neighbors. Gertrude Brown, the first Black head resident of Wheatley, working in conjunction with an all-white board, recounted this disparity she witnessed in an annual report, and this is a quote from her. Unfortunately, we have suffered a little longer than the other fellow. The Negro was the first to be let out of jobs and the last to be taken back. From November 1st to December 1st, 1933, only 5 people were placed through our employment bureau. It is terrible to have to say constantly, I'm sorry, there's no work this morning, but it has been extremely hard to keep up the morale of our people during these distressing days. And I wanted to continue that a little bit. And maybe I'll just break this up a little bit. So that's a little introduction to the Phyllis Wheatley House and how they were kind of important, especially to Black Minnesotans in the Great Depression here. And Hilda eventually went on to teach an art course or a theater course, basically, at the Phyllis Wheatley House. So I want to start back on page 18. So Hilda joined Wheatley as a staff member. By the time the organization had become a hub for community gatherings, it provided more than social programs. It was a center for Black life in 1930s Minneapolis. The settlement home also offered community members an outlet for creativity with its programs in music and theater. Hilda jumped at the chance to participate in and lead programs to augment her experience in the dramatic arts, music, and dance scene, all skills that would prove essential for her Broadway career. One program called Art and Life was uniquely suited to Hilda's acting ability. Designed to get local Black youth involved in theater, the program featured classes on modern dance, verse choir, and possibly most important or appealing to Hilda, one-act plays. Hilda listed herself as a producer and creator of the youth program on an older resume found among her papers. Phyllis Wheatley House's Art and Life program was essential to Hilda's growth as an actor in the same way the organization's focus on equal rights would be essential to her later growth as an activist. Hilda also used her time at Wheatley to assist in planning Urban League and NAACP conferences for local citizens and representatives from other states.
Lovely, very lovely.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that text, you mentioned, I mean, some really big worldwide issues that's currently happening today. Where in Hilda's story do you find the most resonance with today's society? I mean, I can bring up like mass incarceration, and then when I think of, you know, people having to get out and not being able to find a job and, you know, having to work these odd trade jobs.
Yeah.
I'm curious for you, where in Hilda's story is there a resonance, a worldwide resonance for you?
I think it really is through, and I call it activism. I don't necessarily think like historically she would call herself an activist, but definitely like her social consciousness, I think is obviously kind of like a through line from then to the present, right? And especially like being a Black woman who's behind the scenes. And you know, I think Black women nationally, but also as we can see through Hilda locally, have a history of being organizers, leaders, in these ways, whether it's union activism, all kinds of way they participate, right, in society. So I feel like her whole life is kind of an example of that, right? Of someone who is not just also concerned about their own career and kind of their own path forward, but she was also concerned with other actors, whether they be, you know, other Black actors, but also actors of color in general too. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier about having to travel to a completely different state and go to Harlem to conduct research. Is there anything in Hilda's story or in her personal life that you wanted to dig up but you couldn't find?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, well, the main thing, and we were kind of talking about this earlier, but so because of her outspokenness and because of her questioning kind of the status quo in terms of inequality and Black workers getting work and not getting work. And also because of the people that she acted with, like Sidney Poitier, like Paul, well, she didn't act with Paul Robeson, but like crossing paths with him. I think that really flagged the government, and keep in mind, she's coming up through the Great Depression, but also into kind of what we term the Red Scare, right? So this fear of communism that's heightened at this period after World War II. And so I think because of some of the people that she acted with, some of the people that, that she was just in the realm of because she was an actor, because she was an artist, that caught the attention of the government. And so I did learn, like through the research, I did learn that the FBI actually did have a file on her.
wow.
Yeah, so I was just like, what could be in there, right? Like, and I think that's one of my main questions that still remains, like, what is it about her that they thought to flag? And I think they really started that file on her when she was in Europe anyway. So it's really interesting. So I asked for that, like the writing of the book took less time than waiting for those files. So I asked for this right before COVID hit, basically, well, like a year or two before COVID hit. But the National Archives, they were already backed up anyway. And so her files had not been redacted before, and I guess they wanted to maintain the privacy of, the agent, I guess, who was on her file, which I kind of laugh about because I mean, he may have passed by now, but I get it, national secrets or whatever. So so they haven't redacted it, so they have to have someone, like a person, go through and do that. And so, they were already behind, and then COVID hit. So I just never saw that. So I had to kind of write around that. Like, she was in Anna LaCosta with Alice Childress, who was also watched at the time. And so, there are files on her. So I kind of used the actors who were around her to just speculate, really, right? Like, what could it have been about her that they felt was a threat? So I wrote around it that way. So I'm still waiting for those files. As I was telling you guys earlier, it's funny. So the book's just published, and then like last month they were like, "Oh, your files are finally at the top of the list." And I'm like, "Great!" After the book is published, sounds great. And I knew that was a possibility. That was also a challenge too. Is thinking, should I wait for this, or are there other examples that I can use that could point to reasons why she was surveilled? So.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to open up to the audience if there's a question. Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, right.
Just a follow-up question, because you said that the Gibbons Library at U of M has primary sources. Were you able to look at those while you were writing the book, or have you looked at them now?
I haven't yet. And it was interesting because I did a panel for an exhibition that I created with the director of the Gibbons collection. And we're having this conversation. He's like, "Yeah, did you stop by ours?" I was like, "No, like, most of her stuff and just boxes, like I can't even remember how many boxes, are at the Schoenberg. So like her story, right, is there." And he's like, "Yeah, we have some stuff." So I get a grand tour later, I guess, like a private tour of that. But yeah, I haven't seen what they have. So it'll be really interesting to see if it's, like photos, papers, is it playbills, anything really tied to Minnesota that way. But yeah.
Other questions from the audience? So I'm curious to know, you did mention earlier that you faced some publishing challenges, as far as so because Hilda's records are so unknown and hidden, did you face any kind of setback from your publisher with the topic of researching this person, or?
You know what? No, and I'm so grateful. So Josh Leventhal was at the press when I started writing this. And so he was the person I originally pitched the book to, who I sent kind of like the book proposal to. And so I think he really understood the importance of her story, and it's just her deep connections to Minnesota, right? Like some of her family still lives on the north side of Minneapolis. In fact, her niece, who I got to know through the years writing this book, who is a remarkable person. So I think he understood that even if I couldn't get those files, like we would wait for them and just kind of see what happened, because, like even if you've read the book, like I called it Red Stain, and it's true in a sense, but that's not her complete story, right? Like there's just so much more that fills the book of her life, that I think he obviously, like, you know, had faith that this was a biography that was needed without those documents. So I got lucky that someone was understanding enough, right, to kind of see that vision for the book. But yeah.
Very nice. Could you do another reading, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm like, what do I want to read next? I think it's important to maybe even continue with some of these Minneapolis roots events for sure. So in the book, again, in this chapter, in the first chapter, I talk about some of the things that Black people in Minnesota witnessed in this period as well. And so this is kind of continuation of talking about the Wheatley House, but I wrote, Wheatley was the perfect environment for a young Black woman like Hilda, who possessed a growing social consciousness. The Wheatley House often functioned as a hotel for Black stars and speakers who came into town and were denied lodging at white hotels. When Black entertainers and intellectuals such as W.B. Du Bois, activist Paul Robeson were denied accommodations in the city, they found respite in boarding at Wheatley House. Marian Anderson, the famous Black contralto, stayed at the Wheatley House when she was in Minneapolis for previous engagements. But February 1939 was different. After she was denied a room at the Dyckman Hotel in Minneapolis, a protest staged by the local NAACP and the Women's Christian Association raged in front of the swanky hotel. W. Harry Davis, another Minneapolis citizen who had an impact on the civil rights leadership in the city, documented the protest. Staff members at Phyllis Wheatley said to him, "You guys are teenagers now. You've come through the NAACP leadership program. We've taught you about civil rights." The next day, they were carrying signs in front of the Dyckman Hotel. By April, Anderson was preparing for a concert in Washington, D.C., and would face the same segregationist policy she had just experienced in Minneapolis. Unlike the Minneapolis protests, the D.C. incident gained national attention, thanks in part to the involvement of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who left the Daughters of the Revolution after learning that the organization refused to let Anderson perform at the DAR Constitution Hall because she was Black. The rejection in Anderson's subsequent performance in front of the Lincoln Memorial, by request of the First Lady, became a rallying cry against Jim Crow, segregationist policy, and social inequality in the early stages of the civil rights movement. One wonders if the Anderson protest in Hilda's hometown was her first direct experience of racism on such a large public scale. If so, it would have been an early call to arms in Hilda's lifelong fight against inequality. Perhaps her determination to represent Black life in all its complexity came from witnessing a city divided by a famous Black woman's simple request for a hotel room. So I just found that fascinating because I think even before I started, or maybe around the same time I started writing the book on Hilda, I learned that Marian Anderson was denied lodging before she even, the very large national protest that happened in DC, which I just thought was so remarkable because again, it shows the organizing that even though Black Minnesotans remain like a small population in Minnesota, they were just so important, right, to locally, but obviously like kind of these national questions too. So I thought that was super interesting.
Very, very powerful segment.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know because Hilda has such a strong resonance to and obvious resonance to the Phyllis Wheatley Center. How challenging was it for you to find research, not on Hilda, but historical landmarks?
Yeah, luckily, I think the Historical Society does a good job on their Imenopedia. So it's like, Minnesota's encyclopedia of historical events people. So I found things that way, but then also, just being a Black Minnesotan, being raised here, you kind of like know and learn these landmarks. So they're always kind of in the back of your head. So when I do come across things, places where her life kind of intersected with these places, it's just kind of a light bulb kind of goes off. So it's part like local knowledge, part, things like Imenopedia, part, like elders who have preserved histories that way before. So I feel like it was super hard, but that's just because I think me being a local Black Minnesotan,
Right.
made that easier.
Easier.
Yeah.
And Red saying, you did, as you're mentioning, so African American women, you know, they've had a strong role in organizing and activism. And you did mention earlier that Hilda's, you don't want to just put the red stain isn't just all of her story. In what ways do you highlight other parts of her story in this book?
Yeah, I think there are a few things I think are interesting, and again that I think kind of tie to these national themes too. Is I think about her marriage to her second husband was an interracial marriage, and so that I think was important to kind of highlight as well because you know, before the Loving case, I think I'm gonna forget the year. I think it's 1967, if anyone remembers. But interracial marriage was illegal in the United States before the Loving case, right? So, you know, her story kind of intersects with this as well, personally, but also, and I have an excerpt I was going to read. I don't know if we want to jump to that now or not, but she was in a teleplay across Sidney Poitier, and she was playing as his wife, and people in the audience thought she was white. So they had a kiss, and then of course that was controversial. So I think that's one way, you know, and again, also like being a part of unions and acting, being a part, you know, being a woman who wasn't afraid to speak up when she felt she wasn't getting the kind of billing that she thought she could, or like negotiating pay on her own. Sometimes people would write her husband, but she was, you know, always very much involved in it. And I kind of detail that in the book a little bit too. So it's like being a woman in this period, right? Before women could have like bank accounts and credit cards without, you know, their fathers or husbands, you know, signature. So like that's one thing, right? Facing opposition against interracial marriages and relationships. You know, being socially conscious, pushing for equality in her own profession. It's just so many things besides, you know, kind of this really short period of her having her passport revoked, which was later in her career anyway. Yeah.
Other questions from the audience?
Yeah. I must be covering everything. Yeah.
So we're talking about, you know, how landmarks have played a very important role in this book. Where can readers learn more about the Black theater history included in this book?
Wheatley has archives, but so does Haley Q. Brown. They have archives related, not specifically to, I mean, they do have archives related to theater too, but just even in general, in Black Minnesota history is one place you could find that as well. Penumbra is, you know, full of people who just have that firsthand knowledge, but also may have some, I don't know if they necessarily have archives or not, but they may. So those are just like a handful full of places that would have, you know, and again, thinking in terms of like primary sources or sources from the period. Yeah.
And you also mentioned earlier that you're hanging out, I think you said the niece or the.
Yeah.
So how has this book changed your life?
Yeah.
It sounds like it has, like, I mean, the trajectory, you're building connections with.
Yeah, so it's just been crazy in such a good way. Like, so it really started when I wanted to do the presentation on Hilda, and I put, you know, on our Facebook page, hey, we're doing a presentation on this person. And she was like, and we still debate if this is how we met or not. But I'm like, I'm pretty sure you said, hey, that's my aunt. I was like, what? Like she still has family here? Like that's crazy. So she so graciously came to the presentation, and then after that, we kept in contact, and then, you know, even at the presentation, I wasn't quite sure if I was going to write a book or not, right? I was just like, oh, is there even more information? And then the more I found out, when I found out there were her papers were at the Schoenberg, I was like, oh yeah, I want to like try to write a book. So I told her very early on. She was like one of the first people I told that like it got accepted, you know, to be published. Yeah, so Hilda is buried in Resurrection in Mendota Heights here in Minnesota. And so we like found her grave and like found that it was overgrown, which is again just kind of like fitting, right? Like a lost kind of legacy, and we both kind of cleared it together. So we did, you know, interesting things. I guess you could call it interesting things like that. But she's been super supportive, and she was also at the launch of the book too. And it's so interesting because like my Mom comes from a family of like 7 girls and 2 boys, and Nanette that's Hilda's niece, comes from a large family as well. So my 2 aunts came to to the launch, and so they talked, and they talked about all the different nicknames in their families. So yeah, it became really crazy that now that there's like, kind of almost this familial tie, stemming from this woman's story. So yeah. So yeah, we hang sometimes. Yeah.
Very
Mhm.
nice.
Mhm.
Question? May we get another
Mhm.
excerpt, please?
Yeah, sure. And since I mentioned it, I might just skip to um the controversy she had with that quote unquote interracial kiss, which I just still cracks me up to this day. um, and again, I think you were asking me too some other challenges she faced too. She was very light complected Black woman. So that also affected what roles people offered her, but she really was, when she could, she was adamant on representing Black women. So this kind of relates to this. So 2 years later, obviously I was talking about something else. In 1955, Hilda got a chance to star in A Man is 10 Feet Tall on NBC opposite Sidney Poitier, another Ant or American Negro Theater alum. It would be her first experience on American television, a medium she was initially reluctant to embrace. The show was billed as a teleplay or a television play. Directed by Robert Mulligan, who would go on to direct 1962's To Kill a Mockingbird. A 10 Feet Tall centers on the relationship between 2 young men, one white and one Black, grappling with life in post-war America. The teleplay's introspective look at race is what first attracted Hilda to it. Here was another opportunity to prove herself as a dramatic actress. While the teleplay was usually referred to as Potier's first big television break, the same is true of Hilda. The series opens with Axel Nordman, a white main character. Nordman, who lives alone, is dejected and, as we learn later, was AWOL from the army. Potier's character, Tommy Tyler, is Axel's polar opposite. He has a stable family life with his newborn and wife, Lucy, played by Hilda. He's emotionally well-adjusted. He also has a level that Axel lacks. And then I'll skip here a little bit. Poitier, turns out, was just as self-possessed as the character he would go on to play, even as he faced intense scrutiny from NBC executives who were uncomfortable with his activism. As Poitier recalled during the filming of the movie Blackboard Jungle 1955, we were just about to go into rehearsal, no contracts yet, when I got a call from an NBC guy who said, "Could you come in?" So I went in to see him, and again, he gave me this form to sign. It was a loyalty oath. And once again, it made a point of me asking to disassociate myself from this man I greatly admired, Paul Robeson. So that's just a little background. That then we'll jump back to A Man is 10 Feet Tall. So the teleplay Man is 10 Feet Tall was also referred to as a live anthology. Popular in the 1950s, such programs modeled after radio and theater dramas. In this case, A Man is 10 Feet Tall was featured in a lineup of new teleplays. Hilda's theater experiences were a perfect fit since this type of program required fine-tuned skills from actors and technical workers behind the scene. After first airing on October 2nd, 1955, Man garnered rave reviews for its progressive portrayal of a Black male character. However, some conservative viewers didn't like seeing a white man receiving advice from a Black man who was so self-possessed. Furthermore, some white audience members, particularly in the South, mistook the fair-skinned Hilda for a white woman, making an on-screen kiss Poitier and Hilda shared highly controversial. Some whites were shocked NBC would depict a Black man and a white woman kissing. And then I mentioned that this was 13 years before, this is 12 years before Loving versus Virginia and 13 years before Star Trek had their first interracial kiss. So in his biography, he wrote about the other chaos that broke out in the production's control room when Hilda appeared on screen. Well, when we went on air that evening, the switchboard at NBC lit up. It was jammed. You hear me when I tell you, I mean jammed. Jammed from the first scene throughout the whole teleplay, which ran for an hour, live television, a Philco Playhouse presentation. The Philco people were deluged with letters as well, so later. people writing about things being such a scandal. The wonderful irony, of course, is Hilda Simms was Black, not just Black enough to suit the country's perception at the moment. Deluged is right. NBC received over 200 letters expressing anger over an interracial relationship being beamed into their homes. So that's just such a fascinating, complex, thing for her to experience really as an actress. So yeah. Mhm.
Questions? One of the things I love about Red Stain is that
Mhm.
it's an African-American woman, you, the author, who have written about an African-American woman.
Mhm.
And what I know about being a writer myself, but what I know about the publishing field is that there's only 8% of Black narratives being written by Black folks, only 8%.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to know kind of how has this book addressed that problem?
Mhm.
And what was your thought process when you were writing this book?
Mhm.
And in context with, interracial marriage, and then also just like Black voices not being represented in the publishing field.
Mhm. Yeah, oh, that's an interesting question, a really interesting fact. I didn't even know that. So you said 8% of narratives written about Black women are written about by Black women.
By the Black person.
Yeah. So you're asking kind of like how that guided writing this book. Yeah, I think, I can really relate to, really the professional side of things too, like fighting to be taken seriously, right? And her fight was a little bit more complex, right? Because she wanted to be seen as a dramatic actress, again, as we're kind of turning away from these mammy figures, from like kind of the jokester figures that are portrayed in theater and film. So I think recognizing what she might have felt emotionally in the moment, right? Like I might not necessarily write that on the page, but I think being emotionally in tune with her that way probably made me write this in a way that maybe someone else wouldn't have. I I like to think, I think everyone, historians, writers, I feel of nonfiction want to think they're objective, right? But obviously there's a reason why I chose to write the story, why I found it fascinating, why I found it important. So I think being able to relate to some of the rejections she faced, right? Navigating being in an interracial relationship when she's also trying to make sure that Black people are having equality, on and off stage is tough, right? To be taken seriously on both sides of things too. So I just think, yeah, like probably wrote this with more like emotional ties than maybe someone who wasn't a Black woman, right? Because you can see some of the having to work twice as hard, be twice as good for some of the same roles and still not getting them, things like that.
And when I think about
fighting for pay, right?
yeah.
Like other people, yeah.
And when I think about your book too, on like a world view, I think about privilege and wondering how was there because Hilda being a lighter skinned woman back in Jim Crow South days.
Yeah.
How does privilege play a role or did privilege exist in Hilda's story?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I believe it did. Again, I think it opened up certain roles to her that, someone who was darker skinned than her probably wouldn't be offered. Yeah.
But then you mentioned pay. So
Yep.
so is there still a correlation of privilege? So even though she was offered the role, but then maybe got a lesser pay, it's kind of complex.
Exactly. Yep. So, yep. And that's such a good point, is that some of these roles may have been opened up to her, but she constantly had to fight for billing and billing that, like, so, where your name appears, that would just be given to other people if they walked into a role. Right. So yeah, so it's like, right, some of these opportunities may have seemed like they were given to her because of her complexion, but you're right, she still faced just impossible odds of like getting paid, correctly or to standard, right? Dictating a lot of her contract, with her agent and her husband too. So, yeah.
And curious to know too, because again, these issues still exist today. And so when you're saying, you Hilda having to fight for, fairness, equity in her contract. So you as a Black woman, in a very competitive field,
Mhm.
how have your
Mhm.
experience been in the publishing field as far as negotiating contracts and just
Yeah.
asking for writers at home too? What is it
Mhm.
like being a person of color wanting to publish?
Yeah, I mean, I knew, you know, I would have to say for Minnesota, I think I'm lucky that I'm a writer here because I think we're pretty supportive in
Supportive,
general,
yeah.
right? Like of writers, of our creative community. Um, but I can say that I was intimidated when I was shopping around and looking like, oh, well, who would even want to publish this? Because you're right. I would read, I wasn't a writer, like an author before this, so I was trying to get more familiar with publishing. And I was reading that, like, Black stories, Black authors, even if they're not doing like Black stories, right? They're just not published as much. So that was a fear of mine. So I would say, you're saying like kind of in terms of like advice for other writers of color who are kind of looking for an in.
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, I would never want anyone just I would never want to say to anyone, well, don't shoot big for national, right, publishers. But I mean, I guess since I'm just starting out, I think local publishers just made sense to me, right? Made sense for her story, but also because I am like locally based. So I felt that I knew I could at least try to sit down with someone, right? Like I emailed Josh, bothered him that way. But luckily he was open to meeting with me. And I have to remember too, he did actually come to one of my exhibitions that I did for AICM. So he's kind of familiar with the work. So I think people who are familiar with your work, if part of like, supportive communities like the artistic and writing community in Minnesota, probably helped me beat the odds you're talking about of, getting her story published. So, I mean, I don't want to say start small. I think people should shoot for this, moon and land in the stars, or however that saying goes. And that's kind of how I operate in my life too. But I think also kind of being, like you said, being like cognizant of that statistic and those odds, and then just being kind of strategic too about where your story fits best too.
Right.
Yep.
Questions? So in the book, I mean, we're exploring so many different themes. We're talking about Black women and activism, interracial marriage, segregation, and the loving case. I mean, there's so many things you can pull away. Was there a message you want readers to kind of just really take home and put in their pocket? Was there a goal in the book for that?
Yeah, I think there were two goals, and I think maybe they're like more broader goals or broader themes, but one of them is I really want to, and this is kind of what I want to do with my work in general, but it's to tie Minnesota history, especially Black Minnesota history, again, to kind of these national events, national themes that kind of make us as a country, as a nation. And I think that's just so emblematic of her whole career, right? Like growing up through Depression era, right? Having to work as a young woman, um, in a majority white space, and then, trying to become a professional actress. But she gets a lot of her training here in Minneapolis, right? And again, with that example of the Phil Sweetley house, she gets a lot of her exposure to how to actually deal with racism and like how to confront that she has power and agency to do that and not just kind of like, experience it, right? So I think I really want people to take away that there's so much importance in these local stories, that we need to tell these local stories, but we also need to tie them to like our identity as a nation as well. And I think the other theme really is just thinking about, and maybe this really relates to what you were talking about before too, but just a woman in that period is a professional, who's very good at what she does, right? Who had the courage to do it, right? When there's just so many times where she could have accepted rejection and not, and that she did and still just carried on. So I think that's just kind of a larger theme of like self-determination for Black women, for sure.
Absolutely. That's so inspiring. May we have one more excerpt?
Yeah, sure. I'm like, what did I skip? Because I wanted to get to that one. I will, you know what? I guess it makes sense to end with her life a little bit. Why not end with the end? This is kind of a smaller one. The one I'm skipping is in 1962, she was actually testified in front of Congress about inequality that she faced and that she saw behind the scenes in theater. So I definitely say don't skip that part of it if you're reading the book. But yeah, I think I think before you were asking me too, so I actually got to interview another relative of hers, Talisha Rogers, and Hilda actually lived with Talisha the last year or so of her life in Buffalo, when Hilda was living with her sister. So I got to interview Talisha, and she kind of described kind of the end of Hilda's life. Talisha Rogers met her Aunt Hilda in 1993 when Hilda came to live with her and her mother Evelyn. Hilda brought 2 cats with her that were eventually relocated to the attic. Hilda was bedridden by the time, but Talisha describes her aunt as a ball of fire, even the last year of her life. She often requested to have her hair brushed and her nails painted red, a signature for the actress who came of age during the golden age of film. She was also a bit demanding, requiring tea, maybe a custom she picked up in London, and ringing a bell for its delivery. Breakfast, yeah. Breakfast included either peanut butter or avocado toast with tea. So ahead of her time again, right, with avocado toast. Although bedridden, Hilda loved to have the windows open with light flooding in her room, and she tried to remain as independent as possible. She refused to use the bedpan and made trips to the bathroom on her own. When her niece asked through the bathroom door if she needed help, Hilda always said no, wanting to maintain her dignity. She took phone calls from friends, but no one from her former life came to visit. As Hilda neared the end of her fight against cancer, she refused to take her prescriptions. According to Rogers, Hilda didn't want to take anything that artificially prolonged her life, as she had done throughout her storied career. She would leave earthly bounds on her own terms.
Wow, very cool that you got to interview Miss Rogers. Can you kind of talk through that process? How did you get in touch with Miss Rogers?
Yeah, well, thankfully all things stemmed from Nanette, right? Her niece here. So she's like, yeah, you have to talk to Talisha. Like, Hilda lived with her and my aunt, like, at the end of his life. And so, it's kind of, this kind of back and forth trying to get a hold of each other. And we finally just had a phone interview and we talked for a while, and she told me about her aunt. And again, it just kind of, made her real, right?
Exactly.
Because it made her like a real person, especially that end part I thought, was really important to include because, I just talked about how powerful she was and all these things that she had done and faced, but she was a real person, right? And just kind of some of those traits that stayed with her at the end of her life. So yeah, we did a phone interview that way. And, it's kind of like, I don't know if you kind of call it an oral history in a sense, but it was definitely an interview, kind of a method that historians use to fill in some of the blanks when you have questions, right, about this person's life. So yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned that I think is too important for the cultural context is that you mentioned Hilda, being very prideful and she had dignity and didn't want to accept the help. And just when I think about, our community as a collective, we're very prideful people, but as a history, when we talk about history, you've seen African American women working and organizing with organization and just kind of bringing the idea of the African proverb, it takes a village. And so I'm just kind of also curious too, do you think culturally that was kind of Hilda's thinking as far as like?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I could say, she had strong roots in the Black Minnesota, and Black Minneapolis here for sure. And I think that was really familiar to her once she got to New York, right? Because New York at that period, just a hotbed, right, of activism, social growing consciousness around Black issues, right? Arts, right? So she's also part of an artist community. So I think, right. So I think it was very important to her, right, that she was surrounded by like-minded people who were kind of striving for the same things, that she was inspired by them too, as much as, she inspired them. Yeah.
Questions from the audience. We are almost wrapping up.
I'm just wondering, like, what it was like with the actual writing process. Like, was it hard to prioritize what to keep and what to cut in the book?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and this might even be related to your question about the interviews too, but just also how much, because again, this is a woman whose family's still living, right? Her family's still in North Minneapolis. So there were a lot of personal details that I didn't put in the book because, and there were even moments when I was talking to Net specifically, she was like, oh, you could put that in. I was like, thank you for trusting me with that. But, I had to make those kind of calls where it's like, well, people are still living, people are still around, how important is that to her story? And if I found that it wasn't so central to the story, I wouldn't put it in. So I think when it came to more of those like interviews, the personal family histories, I kind of made decisions that way as well. I think the other hard part too is that there were so many boxes. And usually when we talk about Black people, Black women, there really is a dearth of information, right? But she had so much archival material at the Schoenberg that it was also hard to figure out which boxes I wanted to go through. I couldn't go through them all, right? And I made 2 trips there. Maybe eventually I will, right? But so I also had to look through their archival guide and figure out, okay, what documents do I think are going to appear in these boxes that I need to tell her story? So very hard making that decision. And you're right, like as an author, someone writing, I know I don't know how I did feel some kind of weird sense of guilt, like, right, like, what am I really, am I leaving out important things? But I think writers, especially like nonfiction and history, always kind of have that fear, probably, I'm hoping, right? That like, I I hope the things that I looked at and that I interpreted and that I looked at do kind of paint a full picture of her life. However, I don't, how many biographies are there on like Abraham Lincoln, right? Like I'm hoping that this is not the only, book about her, biography about her, whatever about her. I hope this is like a jumping off point too. So maybe other people get a chance to go through the boxes I didn't get to go through. Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question, a really good question. Thank you. Yeah. Mhm.
And we know that research is a skill, and thank you so much for doing all that
Mhm.
research. But again, it's a skill, so not everyone can just get on the internet and
Right.
research, right?
Yeah.
So for the writers at home, how and who want to get into historical and biographical stories,
Mhm.
how do we start? What
Mhm.
platforms do we get
Yeah.
on? What classes do we take?
Yeah. I think it's important for me too, because again, I did my master's in history, so I kind of had an idea of what journals I needed to. But I wrote this in between my break of doing my master's and then joining the PhD program, so I didn't have access to things like JSTOR, things that you get from a university library like the U of M. So I had to kind of like sometimes I would pay for certain articles, sometimes I would find other ways to find them.
Yeah.
Don't tell on me, but so I would say you really probably want to get familiar with how other historians find primary sources, like what databases they use, right? What sources they feel are, reliable in terms of like the information that they're presenting. And really vet that information. And you can do that by, reading other historians who have written books, whether they're like straight history books or their biographies, like thumbing through the index and footnotes and seeing, what kind of archival material they used, what did they feel was actually, like I said, reliable sources of information, especially, related to whatever subject you're writing about as well. So you could start it. What I'm saying is if you don't have access to these journals, you could start with, books that are written, go to places like the library, right? Check out books that are similar to the books that you want to write because they're filled with more than just the story. But, again, if you look through the index, if you look through footnotes, you can find clues there too.
Right, yeah.
Mhm.
Any questions from the audience? We're almost wrapping up.
So myself being a spoken word poet, for me, I always believe that, information should be said out loud.
Mhm.
And with readers having so many different options today to read, they have audiobook, ebooks, there's printed books. I mean, there's anything to really think of.
Mhm.
Can we find Hilda's story
Mhm.
at any point on one of those more audiobook
Yeah.
platforms
Yeah.
and really speaking and
Mhm.
where we can hear you read the story.
Right. Yeah, no, I laughed because my friend was like, "Oh, you should do the eyes." Like, I don't want to read my own my own writing. That scares me. But um but yeah, not now. I don't know that maybe that's coming. I don't know. I guess I would have to ask my press that. But at the moment it's not. Maybe I could just hop on YouTube and read it myself.
Right?
That'd be a long project. But yeah, I mean that's a good question. Yeah, currently not yet. But maybe it's a possibility if if that like opportunity presents itself. But yeah, I do it's you're right because it's an accessibility kind of thing too, right? Because
Mhm.
sometimes even if you don't like have time, sometimes listening to something in the car, like while you're doing a test too. So yeah, I don't know. Ask MNHS Press like who they'll get to like hire, right, to read the book. But yeah. Mhm.
Are there questions from the audience?
Good, good.
All right, so we about have 5 more minutes. Is there any last kind of takeaways that you would like to talk about in regards to that staying that we didn't touch on tonight?
Um, let's see.
And I know you
Yeah.
mentioned the case in 1962, and
Mhm.
since I brought it up, I was curious,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So that was interesting because she was asked among so many other stars and TV executives to come testify before Congress on these unequal hiring processes that she was facing. And that included people like Sydney, the comedian Dick Gregory, again, like executives from like NBC, CBS. So very important people, right, in television and film and actors who became legends and household names. And the fact that Hilda was called shows you just how talented she was, and that other people in Hollywood recognized her talent, right?
Mhm.
And that whoever was asking to find these people were saying, you need to talk to Hilda, right?
Mhm.
Because she's so talented, but also because of the work she was doing. I mean, she was doing surveys about this as well, too, when she was working on the Human Rights Commission in New York on this very topic. So I think that it really highlights again how famous she was, how talented she was, but how important she was to
Mhm.
this. And the fact that there was no book about her before this is just amazing to me that there wasn't more. Yeah.
One of the things that I love about Fireside is that it introduces me to great people and authors like yourself, Jokeda.
Mhm.
So I'm curious to know, have your work always been rooted in, historical and biographical stories, and where can we find more?
Yeah. Ooh, where could we find more? Okay. So I did do a few entries on Immunopedia. One on Virginia Lane Frazier, who was actually a part of the 6999. So Tyler Perry just did this movie on Netflix about this unit of all Black women who cleared mail during World War II. So Virginia is actually born and raised in Minneapolis, and she was a part of the unit. So definitely go on Immunopedia, find that. Did another entry as well on a kind of like a heavyweight boxer, world championship boxer here who was Black in Minnesota. And so yeah, you could find a few entries on Immunopedia. There's the announcement. And then I'm also working on my PhD, and I want to really focus on Black Minnesotans and land ownership through homesteading and how they kind of fostered a sense of belonging. So I'm trying to look at earlier periods of Black Minnesota history, so like 1830s through like 1915. So again, periods that aren't associated with Blackness in Minnesota, right? But that these people were here, and how did they affect the landscape? How did the landscape affect them? So, but that's a longer project that, probably won't be seeing the fruits of for a while, but yeah.
That was great work. And it's
Oh, and I
impactful work.
should say, how can I not say this, but so AICM, so the organization I started, we currently have an exhibition at the Wiseman called Seeking for the Lost. And so after after the American Civil War, so in the post-Reconstruction period, ex-enslaved people or Black people in the United States actually posted ads in newspapers across the country looking for family members that they had lost in slavery. And Minnesota actually reprinted some of these ads in our historically Black newspaper, The Appeal. It doesn't exist anymore. So the Spokesman Recorder is actually the longest running now, but The Appeal was kind of before it, late 1800s. So I used ads from our Black Minnesota historical newspaper, The Appeal, and created an exhibition on that. So, and I think that closes February 16th. So it's at the Wiseman if anyone wanted to go see that.
Well, thank you so much, Jokeda. This was a great
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
You're doing amazing, impactful work. And
Thank
just
you.
as a Black woman myself, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
All right. And to wrap up, that's all we have. Again, thank you, Jokeda, and audience, please have a great night.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. Yep. Yeah.